The galaxy had many names for her, but all of them carried the same meaning, that she was death-given flesh. Entire syndicates feared her, governments kept her name out of their records, and smugglers whispered of her in dark bars, as if saying it too loudly would summon her shadow. Mira had lived her whole life this way, as a figure of silence and steel, never once failing a mission. Her life was marked by precision, by cold efficiency, and by a loneliness so deep she never stopped to feel it. She was an assassin not because she wanted to be, but because from the earliest age she had been shaped into one, taught that hesitation was weakness, and weakness meant death. For years this thought had kept her alive, and it had also chained her soul in iron. Her latest assignment brought her to a vast, orbital station that hung like a jewel above a mineral-rich planet. The station was a place of business and politics, where trade delegations met, and power was exchanged through smiles that never reached the eyes. Mira had a target there, some alien merchant whose growing influence had irritated the wrong people. For her, it was simply another job, another name on a list, another life that would end by her hand. She moved through the crowded corridors, unseen, her cloak adjusting to the light, her senses sharp and ready. Every step she took was part of a dance she had rehearsed 1,000 times before. What she did not expect was the human. He appeared in her path not with weapons or bodyguards, but with the clumsiness of someone who clearly did not belong in such a cold place. Daniel was his name, though Mira did not know it then. He carried himself like someone who had been dropped into the middle of a storm, yet refused to let the wind break him. His mission was diplomatic, though. On this station, diplomacy meant survival against creatures who could tear him apart with a gesture. He wore no armor, only a plain suit that already looked out of place among glittering robes and scales. He was, to Mira's eye, fragile and unimportant, hardly worth noticing. Yet fate or chance allowed their paths to collide. She turned a corner sharply, her mind already replaying the routine of killing, and he walked straight into her. The impact was light, but in that instant her instinct screamed to strike. Number 1 touched her and lived. Her hand moved toward the blade hidden in her sleeve, and she prepared to silence the clumsy man before he could apologize. But then he looked at her. Not with fear, not with recognition, not with the sharp panic of prey, but with something else entirely. He gave a small smile, nervous yet genuine, and whispered words she had never once heard directed at her in her whole life. "You're beautiful." For a moment she froze. The blade remained concealed, her training screamed to act, but her mind went blank. She had been called many things: killer, ghost, demon, shadow, but never beautiful. That word had no place in her world, no meaning in her blood-stained history. Yet here it was, dropped like a fragile stone into the still waters of her soul, creating ripples she could not control. She said nothing, only stared at him, her mask of steel cracking ever so slightly. Then he walked past, muttering a quick apology, completely unaware that he had spoken the most dangerous words of his life. Mira remained still long after he disappeared into the crowd. She should have dismissed him, should have erased him from her thoughts the way she erased every witness, but she found herself replaying his voice. She wondered why he had said it, whether he had meant it, whether he had even realized who she was. The galaxy's deadliest assassin stood alone in a corridor, shaken not by battle or blade, but by a single human compliment. Later that night, she observed him again. He was part of the entourage surrounding her target, the merchant whose arrogance made enemies faster than wealth could protect him. The human stood out because he seemed out of place yet comfortable in his own way, greeting guards and attendants with a smile, speaking gently to servants, bowing his head respectfully to those who despised him. His diplomacy was quiet but powerful, like water carving stone. She found herself watching him longer than necessary, forgetting for brief moments that her purpose was death, not curiosity. When her target retired to his private quarters, Mira prepared to finish the job. The path was clear, her movements perfect. But again, her thoughts strayed. She remembered the compliment, the smile, the strange softness in his voice. She had been called many things by enemies and allies alike, but never something that made her feel human. She tightened her grip on her blade, shaking off the distraction. She could not afford weakness. Weakness meant failure, and failure meant her own death. Still, when she passed through the corridor again, her eyes searched for him. Daniel, though she still did not know his name, was speaking to a group of aliens with calm confidence. They towered over him, armed and dangerous, yet he did not flinch. Mira wondered what it was about this human that allowed him to face giants with nothing but words. She wondered why his simple compliment lingered in her chest like a wound that would not close. For the first time in her life, Mira felt something foreign. It was not fear, not anger, not the thrill of the hunt. It was something far more dangerous to her survival. It was curiosity. And that curiosity made her hesitate. As the lights of the station dimmed to signal night cycle, Mira realized her perfect rhythm had been disrupted. She was still the galaxy's deadliest assassin, but something had changed in her. A human had walked into her path and spoken words that should have meant nothing, yet they meant everything. The mission remained, the target awaited, but her thoughts were no longer as sharp as her blades. For the first time, Mira was not sure who she truly was, and somewhere deep inside, though she would never admit it aloud, she wanted to hear him call her beautiful again. Mira had carried out missions in every corner of the galaxy and in every environment imaginable. She had killed in crowded cities and in lonely deserts, in palaces glittering with jewels and in the void of abandoned ships. She had done it without thought, without hesitation, because that was the way she survived. Yet now, as she sat alone in her hidden chamber aboard the station, the words of one human echoed in her mind again and again. "You are beautiful." She hated the way it lingered, hated the way it made her wonder, hated the way her chest tightened as if she was more than a weapon. She told herself that it was foolish to even think of him, that he was just another face in the endless crowd. But her mind betrayed her. She had never been called anything but a killer, and now this stranger had planted a seed she could not kill. Her employer contacted her through encrypted channel. The voice was cold and harsh, a reminder of who she was and what she was made for. The order was clear. The merchant was still the target, but a complication had been added. The human diplomat was interfering, moving too close to the merchant's affairs, speaking to the wrong people. His words could unravel careful schemes, and the syndicate could not allow that. He was now added to the list. The order carried no hesitation. The human must die along with the merchant. Mira listened in silence, her face blank, her eyes unblinking. She had taken orders all her life, and normally she would accept without question. But when the channel closed and the room fell into quiet again, she found her hand trembling. The thought of killing him was supposed to be nothing, another line of work, another task to complete. Yet instead she felt an unexpected weight pressed down on her chest. For the first time in her career, she did not want to kill the target given to her. She went out into the station once more, moving unseen through the neon-lit corridors. She tracked Daniel with the same precision she used on all her targets. He was easy to follow, too easy, because he carried no sense of fear. He walked with calm purpose from one meeting to another, carrying messages and speaking words that tried to ease tension among powerful beings who despised compromise. Mira watched him greet an alien servant with kindness, saw him kneel to speak to a child left wandering the halls, witnessed him smile even when larger creatures towered over him with disdain. He acted in ways that made no sense in her world, because her world had always been filled with violence, betrayal, and blood. Yet here was a fragile human who faced it all without a single weapon. She followed him for days, shadowing his every step. She could have ended him at any moment, a silent strike in the dark, a cut that would leave no sound. But every time she raised her weapon, she remembered his words. "You are beautiful." The blade hesitated, her hand faltered, and she lowered it again. It made her furious because hesitation was something she had been trained to erase from her soul. Her instructors had broken her body to make her obey, had drilled into her mind that any doubt meant weakness and weakness meant death. Yet Daniel had undone all of that with one simple compliment. The syndicate did not wait long before they grew suspicious. Her employers sent messages laced with anger, asking for reports, demanding results. They reminded her of her place, reminded her that she was nothing but a tool, and tools that failed were discarded. Still she delayed, still she searched for reasons not to act. When she looked at Daniel, she did not see a target anymore. She saw someone who dared to see her as a person, even if it had been only for a fleeting second. On the fourth night cycle, she found herself outside the quarters assigned to him. She stood in the shadows, her cloak blending with the walls, her weapon ready. The lock on the door was nothing to her. She entered silently, the way she had entered 1,000 rooms before. He was there, seated at a desk with dim light above, reading through lines of alien script. He did not sense her at first, but then he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, neither moved. She had her weapon raised, prepared to end him, yet he did not scream or run. Instead, he spoke in that same steady voice that had unsettled her the first time. "You don't have to do this." The words struck her harder than any blade could have. He should have been terrified. He should have begged or tried to fight. But he looked at her with a calm certainty that unsettled her more than any guard ever had. She felt her hands shake, her weapon slipping lower. Her entire life had been a straight line, clear and unbroken. But in that instant, it bent sharply. She could not kill him. She could not bring herself to end the only person who had looked at her and seen something more than a shadow. She turned away without a word and vanished back into the halls, leaving him alive. That single act was enough to change everything. The syndicate would know. They always knew. She had defied them, and for the first time in her life, she was no longer their perfect weapon. Now she was their enemy. Mira did not sleep that night. She thought of her past, of the endless training, the lives she had taken, the silence she had lived in. For years she had believed there was nothing beyond the blade, nothing beyond the mission. But Daniel had shown her something else, even if it was only through a few words. He had reminded her that beneath the armor she was still human. That realization frightened her more than any battle she had fought. When morning cycle came, the station pulsed with activity. Merchants and soldiers moved about, unaware of the storm that was forming. Mira stood in the shadows once more, but now she was not watching her target. She was watching the man she had been ordered to kill, the man she could no longer bring herself to harm. She did not yet know what would happen next. She only knew that the galaxy had shifted, and with it, her place in it. For the first time in her life, Mira felt the chains of her old world break slightly. And though she knew the cost of defiance would be great, a strange thought filled her mind. Perhaps she was ready to stop being a weapon and start being something else. The days that followed were different from Mira. In the past, she would have moved quickly, ended her assignment, collected her payment, and vanished before anyone even realized she had been there. That was the way of an assassin, a ghost that left nothing behind but silence. Now she lingered in the shadows not because she needed to, but because she wanted to watch him. Daniel continued his work, meeting with alien envoys, speaking softly to hostile delegates, standing calmly, even when voices around him rose in anger. Mira found herself studying him as if he was a puzzle she could not solve. He had no weapons, no armor, no training in violence, and yet he walked among predators with the kind of strength she had never known. His strength came not from killing, but from refusing to bow to fear. She thought often about the night she had stood in his quarters with her blade ready to end his life. She remembered his calm words, "You don't have to do this," and the way they had struck her deeper than any weapon. She had never heard such a thing. Her targets had begged, screamed, cursed, tried to bribe her, but never once had anyone told her she had a choice. She had been told all her life that choice was an illusion, that she existed only to serve the orders given to her. Yet one human had looked at her as if she could be something else, and now she was no longer certain of the rules that had defined her existence. The syndicate's response came sooner than expected. She felt their eyes on her everywhere. The hunters they sent were not amateurs but trained killers, shadows like herself, bred for silence and death. She sensed their presence as she moved through the station, saw reflections in glass, glimpsed figures disappearing into crowds. They were not here to remind her of her duty. They were here because she had already failed. Her hesitation had marked her as a traitor. The syndicate never forgave traitors. One evening she watched Daniel leave a meeting and head toward the outer rings of the station. She followed at a distance, unseen by him but alert to the hunters she knew trailed them both. He entered a small market where vendors of many species sold rare items from across the stars. He walked among them like a curious traveler rather than a diplomat, smiling at their goods, speaking words of thanks in broken fragments of their languages. To the vendors he was harmless, even charming, but Mira knew the danger. She sensed the hunters closing in, their steps matching his path. When the first of them moved, Mira was faster. A silent blur of motion cut across the market as her blade met theirs in the narrow space between stalls. The clash was hidden in the noise of the crowd, but the fight was real and brutal. She dispatched the first with swift precision, then turned on the second before they could strike at Daniel. He noticed the commotion, confusion in his eyes as people scattered, but he did not yet see the truth. Mira moved with cold efficiency, her cloak swirling as blades met and bodies fell. When it was over, she melted back into the shadows, leaving Daniel shaken, but alive. Later that night, he found her waiting outside his quarters. For the first time since their strange connection began, she spoke to him in a voice that carried more humanity than she had ever allowed herself to show. She told him he was in danger, that the syndicate would not stop until he was dead, and that by sparing him, she had made herself their enemy as well. He looked at her with eyes full of questions, but he did not back away. Instead, he asked her why she had chosen to protect him. She did not know how to answer. She wanted to tell him that his words had broken something in her, that she could not bring herself to kill the only person who had seen her as more than a weapon, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said simply that he needed to survive because his voice mattered more than her blade. Daniel listened without judgment, and in his silence she felt an understanding she had never known from anyone else. From that moment, they became unwilling companions. She kept to the shadows, guarding him as he moved through his duties, while he accepted her presence without fear. At times he even spoke to her quietly when no one else was near, asking her questions about her past, her training, her life. She gave little away, but she found herself answering more than she intended. He never condemned her for the lives she had taken, never looked at her with horror. Instead, he looked at her as though he could see the person hidden beneath the scars. Hunters did not stop. Each day brought new dangers, ambushes in crowded streets, traps in dim corridors, shadows moving in pursuit. Mira fought them off with the skill that had earned her the title of Deadliest assassin, but now every fight carried more weight. She was no longer fighting for payment or reputation. She was fighting for his survival, and with it, the fragile piece of humanity he had awakened in her. Daniel began to understand the cost of her choice. He saw the way she moved with exhaustion after nights of battle, the way her eyes scanned every room for threats, the way her hand never strayed far from her blade. He realized she was risking everything for him, though she had no reason to. One evening, as they hid in the dark recess of the station to escape another squad of hunters, he whispered that he was sorry for the life she had been forced to live. She did not reply, but in the silence she felt something shift inside her again. Myra knew the station would not hold forever. The syndicate's reach was vast, and the hunters would not stop until they were both dead. She would have to make a decision: soon flee with him beyond the syndicate's grasp, or confront the storm head-on. Both choices carried risk, but she knew one truth. She could no longer walk away from him. He had become more than a target, more than a mission. He had become the reason she was still alive. For the first time in her life, the deadliest assassin in the galaxy felt the weight of choice pressing on her shoulders. And though fear still lingered, she found herself ready to bear it. The moon that circled the mining planet was dead and empty, its surface littered with scars of long-abandoned machines and half-collapsed structures left behind by those who had taken everything of value and fled. It was the kind of place no one cared about, and that made it the perfect place for the syndicate to close the trap. Mira knew it before their ship even landed, knew it in the silence that pressed on her skin like ice, knew it in the way the shadows stretched too long across the broken corridors. She had been hunted before, but never like this. These were not common killers or petty bounty hunters. These were her own kind, trained in the same ways, sharpened by the same cruelty, and unleashed with the same purpose. Only now their blades were pointed at her. Daniel followed her closely, though she told him again and again that he should run while there was still time. He shook his head each time, stubborn in a way that made her both frustrated and strangely comforted. He told her he would not abandon her, that she had already risked everything to save him, and that his voice meant nothing if he survived only by leaving her to die. His words made little sense to the part of her that still fought like a weapon, but they made perfect sense to the part of her that was slowly learning what it meant to be human again. They moved together through the ruins of the moon, the wind whispering across stone, the silence broken only by distant creaks of rusted metal. Mira felt the hunters long before she saw them. She knew their patterns because they were her patterns. She knew the way they used stillness as cover, the way their eyes scanned for weakness, the way they would move in perfect silence until the kill. Every instinct screamed that they were surrounded. The first attack came at dusk, if dusk could be measured on a moon that had no sun of its own. Shadows leapt from the broken walls, blades flashing, cloaks rippling. Mira reacted instantly, pushing Daniel behind her as she met the strike with the speed of someone who had never known hesitation. The clash was brutal, faster than the eye could follow, steel against steel, training against training. She moved with deadly grace, her body remembering every lesson drilled into her bones. But this time she was not fighting for money or reputation. This time she was fighting to keep him alive. The hunters were relentless, striking from every angle, testing her defenses, searching for openings. She cut them down one by one, but each strike burned more energy. Each wound slowed her slightly. Daniel stayed low, trying not to be a burden, though his eyes followed every movement with a mix of fear and awe. He had never seen such violence up close, never understood the full meaning of the name the galaxy whispered when they spoke of her. Now he saw it, and he understood why she had been both feared and lonely. They retreated deeper into the ruins, finding shelter in a collapsed mining tunnel. Mira's breath came heavy, her wounds shallow but bleeding. Daniel tore strips from his clothing to bind them, his hands steady even as his face showed worry. She let him, though she had never allowed anyone so close before. His touch was gentle, nothing like the harsh training she had known. And for a moment she let herself believe she was more than a weapon. The night stretched long. Mira knew the hunters would not stop, that they would press harder with every failure, that they would keep coming until either she or Daniel lay dead. She thought about leaving him behind, about drawing them away so he could live. But when she looked at him, she knew she could not. He had become more than the mission, more than the compliment that had first shaken her. He had become the reason she could no longer accept the life she had been forced into. The final confrontation came at dawn. The hunters closed in with precision. Dozens of them, their cloaks blending with the ruins, their blades gleaming in the pale light. Mira stood ready, her body tired but her will unbroken. She told Daniel to stay behind her, to keep low, to trust her. He nodded, not with fear but with the same quiet trust he had shown her from the beginning. The battle was chaos and silence at the same time. Mira moved like fire through the ruins, cutting down one after another, her body a storm of speed and precision. Yet for every one that fell, two more pressed forward. She fought with everything she had, every skill, every memory of training, every drop of strength. Daniel tried to help, throwing stones, distracting attackers, anything he could do though. He knew he was only human among killers. Still his presence gave her more strength than she would admit. She was no longer fighting alone. At one point she stumbled, a blade grazing her side, and for a moment she thought it was over. But Daniel rushed forward, dragging her out of reach, shielding her with his own body, though he had no way to defend himself. The sight of him standing there unarmed, refusing to move, refusing to abandon her, lit something inside her that burned brighter than all the training and all the cruelty she had ever known. She rose again, her blade flashing with renewed fury, and cut down the ones who dared to threaten him. When the last of the hunters fell, silence returned to the ruins. Mira stood bleeding, her cloak torn, her body trembling from exhaustion. Daniel caught her before she collapsed, holding her with arms that shook but did not let go. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air was heavy with smoke and blood, yet in his arms she felt something she had never felt before. Safety. Mira realized then that she had crossed a line that could never be undone. She had betrayed the syndicate beyond forgiveness, had killed her own kind, had broken every rule that had once defined her life. But she also realized that for the first time she had chosen her own path. She had fought not for orders, but for someone she cared for, and that choice had given her more strength than all the cruelty of her past ever had. As the sun rose weakly over the dead moon, Daniel whispered to her that they would survive this, that they would find a way to escape the reach of the syndicate. She looked at him, weary but alive, and though she did not speak, her silence was filled with something new, hope. The ruins of the moon were silent after the battle, but Mira knew the silence would not last. The syndicate was too vast, its reach too long, for them to believe that a handful of dead hunters meant safety. It only meant that the chase would grow harder, that the hunters would become more ruthless, that the price on their heads would rise with every passing hour. She had spent her life being the one who pursued, and now she felt the weight of being the one pursued. But unlike before, she was no longer alone. Daniel supported her as they made their way through the broken tunnels, his arm around her shoulders steady though his body was weary. He had not been trained for this kind of survival, yet his strength did not come from training. It came from a determination she had never seen in anyone else, a refusal to give up no matter how dark the path became. She leaned on him not just for balance, but for something deeper, something she had never allowed herself to accept from anyone: trust. They found shelter in an old command station half buried in the dust. The place had long since been abandoned. Its screens dark, its consoles broken, but its walls still stood strong enough to give them a few hours of rest. Mira collapsed onto the floor, her body aching with wounds and exhaustion. Daniel worked quietly, cleaning her injuries with what little he had, tearing more strips from his clothing to bind them. His hands were gentle, careful, and she found herself watching him not with suspicion, but with a strange calm that felt new and unfamiliar. When he finished, he sat beside her in the dim light. For a long time neither spoke. The silence was not the heavy silence of killers waiting in the dark, but a softer silence, a silence that allowed them both to breathe. At last Daniel spoke. He told her that he had seen enough to know she was not the monster the galaxy believed her to be. He said that no weapon would have fought so hard to protect someone else. She turned her head away, her eyes on the cracked wall, because she could not bear the weight of his words. She had taken too many lives, spilled too much blood, to ever believe herself worthy of such kindness. Yet deep inside, a part of her wanted to believe him. The following days were filled with movement. They stole a ship from a forgotten hangar and slipped away from the moon just before more hunters arrived. Mira guided them through hidden routes in space, places she knew from years of traveling in secrecy. Each time they escaped, she knew the syndicate would follow, but each time she also knew they still had a chance. Daniel remained by her side through it all, helping where he could, never once complaining, never once turning away from the danger that surrounded them. On one quiet journey between systems, he asked her what she wanted. The question seemed simple, but for Mira it was heavier than any order she had ever been given. She had never wanted anything for herself. She had been told what to do, where to go, who to kill. Her life had been nothing but obedience to the will of others. Now for the first time she was free to choose, and she did not know how. She told him she did not have an answer, that she had no idea what it meant to want. He smiled softly and told her that perhaps the answer was not something she needed to find alone. As they traveled farther from the heart of Syndicate space, Mira began to notice changes in herself. She no longer looked at every corridor as a trap, no longer kept her hand on her weapon every second. She still carried the habits of survival, but now she also carried something else. When she looked at Daniel, she felt the strange warmth of belonging. He spoke to her not as a weapon, but as a person. He asked her about the stars, about her childhood, about the scars she carried. She gave him pieces of herself slowly, fragments of a story she had never shared with anyone. And in return, he gave her something she had never expected: forgiveness. Final test came when the Syndicate found them again. This time it was not hunters in the shadows, but a warship that cut across the stars, massive and armed with weapons that could destroy them in seconds. Mira knew they could not fight it, knew that their stolen ship was nothing against such power. But she also knew they could not run forever. She stood at the controls, her hand hovering over the weapon system, and felt the weight of choice pressing down on her once again. Daniel placed his hand over hers and told her that she did not need to fight alone. He said that together they could find another way, that survival did not always mean killing. His words reminded her of that first moment, when he had called her beautiful, when he had seen her as more than a shadow. She lowered her hand from the weapon and instead guided their ship into a narrow field of asteroids. It was a dangerous path, filled with spinning rock and sharp metal, but she trusted her skill and the strength of the one who sat beside her. Together they navigated through the chaos, and the massive warship, too large and too proud, could not follow. For the first time in her life, she had chosen not to kill and had still survived. When they finally reached the safety of a quiet system far from Syndicate eyes, Mira felt something inside her shift completely. She realized that she was no longer the assassin the galaxy feared. She was still dangerous, still skilled, still scarred by all she had done, but she was no longer only those things. She was something else, something new, something fragile and yet stronger than before. She was someone who had been seen, and not as a weapon, but as a person. In the silence of the ship, Daniel looked at her with the same calm eyes that had first unsettled her. He whispered the word again, softly, as if it was meant only for her. Beautiful. She did not look away this time. She let the word settle inside her, not as a wound, but as a seed of something she had never thought possible. Mira knew the syndicate would never stop hunting, that their past would never fully disappear, that shadows would always linger at the edges of her life. But she also knew that for the first time she had something worth protecting, something worth living for. She had a choice, and she chose to live it not as a ghost, but as a person who had finally found meaning beyond the blade. And as the stars stretched endlessly before them, Mira sat quietly beside Daniel, no longer the galaxy's deadliest assassin, but a woman who had finally learned what it meant to be alive. The end.